thanks again for agreeing to be on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to be having the chance to sort of converse with the CISO of Infosys, right? Being an Indian myself, I think the name Infosys sort of very much conjures up emotions of great pride in sort of the corporate ability of India. So it's a real pleasure. So look, right, I was kind of always like starting these with a bit of the background story, right? So in your case, I see that you started off as a marketing executive at Crompton Greaves. For those who are not familiar with the Crompton Greaves brand, they are famous for making electrical household goods. In my case, it reminds me of ceiling fans at our home in India. So, how does a marketing executive at an electrical goods firm go on to become CISO and head of cyber practice at one of the world's largest IT services companies?
Hey, thank you so much, Raghu, for having me here on your show. And thank God I was not selling fans. So Crompton Greaves in 1993 were having a computer division, and they were selling computers. So that's really why I got into there, and I was selling computers. So my first job literally was a sales job, right? And for some reasons they used to call it marketing executive, but really I was on the road and I was selling computers,
Hmm.
and actually that gave me a very good uh, you know access to really what's happening, how to really address the problem of inhibition, meeting people and so on, so other things. So I'm glad I did that, but I
Hmm.
was really hopeless in selling in those days, and so quickly I pivoted to a practitioner's role, and
Hmm.
it's been a combination of hard work, preparation, and luck, which has got me to
Hmm.
where I am today.
And all of those I think are equally important to make a successful career, right? So I'm just curious. What was the first computer you sold? Do you remember?
I sold only one computer in my 9 month stint, and that was to a Hindi department in State Bank of India. So that's how hopeless I was. But jokes apart, I think it was all about working with the team. And in those days, we were really selling very basic set of computers. So simple
Hmm.
assembled computers. Which were in those days it was not about manufacturing or anything. It's all about buying parts from different parts of the
Yeah.
organization and then putting it together. So that's really what it was.
Yeah, I have, as you probably imagine, I have lots of family members who are in the IT sector, particularly in and around Bangalore. And I very much remember that sort of the uh, the decade of assembled computers, just kind
Yes.
of how the PC made its way into households in India. So understanding how you kind of got into IT, right, and becoming an IT practitioner. But then, what was the evolution to becoming a cybersecurity practitioner, right? How did that journey manifest itself?
I mean, that's again an interesting question. So I used to work in a bank, Standard Chartered, and I was quickly moving into leadership role in technology, and we were going through a major
Hmm.
organizational change. Where there was an acquisition and so many other changes which were happening, and this job of driving cybersecurity, or in those days we used to call it IT security,
Yeah.
was offered to me. And I've always believed in a philosophy of trusting your managers in terms
Hmm.
of what they're thinking for you.
Hmm.
And so I would just go by their instincts and their belief in me. And so I just accepted it and embraced it. And that conversation is still very vivid in my mind in terms of when I was offered. But it obviously elevated me to a different peer group because I took that role. Uh, those days, I used to have a couple of people reporting to me. We used to do firewall and access
Yeah.
management and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And I never really thought that I would end up doing this for rest of my career, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and then and I thought, and I continued with that notion for almost 6 7 years before I
Mm-hmm.
really, and I continued to do various roles in security. And before I took my real serious formal commitment and role in HDFC Bank as a CISO, right, in
Mm-hmm.
2007. So for almost 7 years, I thought I'll go back to the line and I'll do some other leadership, technology leadership
Mm-hmm.
roles. But I think, from 2000 onwards till so from 93 to 2000 was technology leadership roles. And from
Mm-hmm.
then, from 2000 to 2007 was just doing multiple things in cyber. But by the time it grew on me so much and looked like a great profession to be
Mm.
in, which is when I committed to become the CISO, right? And since then, I've not looked back.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's fascinating, and it's interesting what you should see about what you said about you kind of it's almost like this whole cyber role was thrust on you, right? And then you of course you went off to HDFC and you became the CISO there, and then have essentially continued being essentially had become a career CISO, as it were, right? And I think it's really interesting because I think the CISO role compared to other roles in information systems, information technology, is such a specialist role, right? It's almost like once a CISO, always a CISO versus just another IT manager, IT exec that sort of moves around doing various functions. I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think if you look at it, I think my career has evolved as the profession has evolved, and so
Mm,
when I sort of got into it, it was never a career choice because we never really knew how it will become a mainstream topic, how it will evolve. Nobody had a clue about it, right? And look at where it is right now. I mean, we are talking about 25 years, right? I've
yeah.
almost spent 20 to 23 years in this journey from 2000 till now. And I think this profession itself has evolved, right? And I think if you look at the profession right now, it will obviously, and if you look at it holistically, whether it is you're doing a CISO role or any
Mm,
important leadership role in cyber, uh, in my mind, it will test your various faculties, and various
mm-hmm,
aspects of your leadership qualities, whether it is about communication, whether it is about giving a strategy, whether it is about understanding technology, whether it is about influencing people, whether it is about executing
mm-hmm,
projects, and it's about engaging with stakeholders like your law enforcement,
yeah.
government authorities. So there are a plethora of elements that you sort of have to display, and and it will test your complete
Mm-hmm.
leadership skills. And that's the most fascinating aspect of this role.
100%. And actually, there's, I mean, that's fascinating. I want to talk a bit more about you're a CISO at Infosys today. You're also head of their cyber practice, right? So, which is interesting because one is around the essentially owning the cybersecurity of the Infosys as the organization, right? And the other one is external facing and delivering amazing security outcomes for your clients, right? What are the overlaps between those two roles, and what are sort of the different areas of focus as well that you have to manage?
Yeah, I think cybersecurity as a topic, is the same in both the areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you're talking about solving the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to my CISO role, it's about making sure that Infosys infrastructure is safe
Mm-hmm.
and secure. And when it comes to my role as driving the business and working with our clients and customers, it's about making delivering on the mandates that we have,
Mm-hmm.
and making sure that we are able to create constant value and able to
Mm-hmm.
help the client see so successful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, at the end of the day, we are still solving the same problem,
Yeah.
but the approach that you take is obviously chalk and cheese, because because the accountabilities, responsibilities are very different in both the
Yeah, of
aspects. I
course.
think you're kind of, you're kind of sitting in the driver and a pilot seat when it comes to
Yeah.
your organization CISO. Whereas when it comes to
Hmm.
working with clients, I mean, it's the clients who are sitting, but we are actually supporting. We are the support staff to
Yeah.
make sure that we give
Yeah.
all the necessary fuel, engine, resources, capabilities, expertise to make them successful.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what are things that, let's say, you have learned or you have practiced within Infosys that you're able to say, actually, these are great things that we should go and take to our clients, right? And vice versa, of things that you've observed at clients or you've delivered for clients and realized these are actually great things that we need to adopt internally to uplift our security posture. How much of that happens?
Yeah, I think it happens on both sides. But I think one of the things that is the biggest advantage for me personally is that when I'm looking at my responsibility as a business leader to drive value for our clients, I have a deep sense of empathy towards what they go through on a daily
Hmm.
basis, right? Because I'm living that role every single day, right?
Hmm.
Unlike any typical business leader who would not be so deeply empathetic because they are not really having that, they're not able to see it as closely, right? So they will, if you just
Hmm.
drive it as a business leader, it is in a way superficial, right? You will not be able to go deep into
Yeah.
really understanding
Yeah.
what's happening. And so you run it as a business rather than running it as a, as a CISO or as a practitioner. But I think to answer your specific question, I guess because of the deep empathy, I am able to steer on both sides.
Hmm.
And so when we, for example, do some innovation, and we do a lot of innovation internally to try and be on the cutting edge of driving innovation in
Hmm.
cybersecurity. Like for example, we around 5 or 6 years back, we ran a completely different metric measurement program within
Hmm.
Infosys, and we did hyper automation for that, and we built a lot of IP
Hmm.
around that. And after running it for 4 years
Hmm.
successfully, we thought it had come to a stage where we could take it to our
Hmm.
customers, and we kind
Hmm.
of did a reverse engineering where we kind of migrated that whole code and that whole solution to our practice team, and now the practice team has scaled it up and they support
Hmm.
Infosys now for all the innovation and change which are happening because we're able to sense that from our customers and get that feedback. And we're seeing a lot of that happening for other things. Like for example, when we are incubating a practice, we can take some resources from our practice team and get internally and use them to
Hmm.
incubate that, get it to a
Hmm.
particular level of maturity, and then pull it back to give it back to our customers. So it creates a lot of possibilities and advantages, for us. And the fact that we are able to expose to what's happening um, with all our customers, right?
Hmm.
The sentient nature of being able to sense and understand, we can obviously then use that knowledge to strengthen our understanding of what's
Yeah.
happening in the threat landscape and use it internally for Infosys as well.
Yeah, I love the way you expressed that as very much almost both being incubators for improvement on the other side, right? And that sort of very rich feedback loop that you have. So kind of let's now sort of switch gears a bit and go back to sort of what does zero trust mean to the CISO of Infosys?
Yeah, so I think let's take a step back.
Yeah.
Cybersecurity is all about risks, vulnerabilities, and threats, right?
Hmm.
And if you are to just extend it, you can also talk about incidents, right? So
Yeah.
so so at the end of the day, we are always dealing with incidents, we are dealing with vulnerabilities, we are dealing with threats, and we are dealing with risks. These are the only
Hmm.
four things that we are dealing with.
Yeah.
Now that is universal. That is never going to
Yeah.
change for decades, right? That's how it
Yeah.
started, and that is how it will remain.
Yeah.
What we do in terms of our methodology, so we had BS 7799, then we have ISO 27001,
Yeah.
and then we have so many different standards, then we had
Hmm.
NIST. We have various risk measurement methodologies like FAIR, FISMA,
Mm-hmm.
all of that, and then we have so many different standards. All of this is evolution of how we are looking at solving this problem.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, it is still about risk, vulnerabilities, incidents, and threats, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the fundamental tenets of information security are still intact,
Mm-hmm.
and fundamental tenets will continue to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, then when we look at something like a zero trust, what does it really mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, we used to call this profession as information security till 2008, 2007.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly it became cybersecurity, and everybody now talks about it as cybersecurity. Tomorrow, we will start calling it as digital security,
Mm.
right? So the nomenclatures may change, right? But the profession advances, but the
Mm-hmm.
foundation remains the same. The
Yeah.
fundamentals remain the same. And so I would say zero trust is
Mm-hmm.
the evolution of that same thing.
Yeah.
When we have evolved throughout this, zero trust is a new concept.
Mm-hmm.
Tomorrow there is something else which will come in.
Yeah.
It's just that, just like cybersecurity word has stuck for last 1 decade,
Yeah.
zero trust perhaps will also get stuck for some more time before something else,
Yeah.
something more appealing
Yeah.
comes in.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not just marketing, right? It
Yeah.
is, I think it's emerging as a philosophy, and the underhood philosophy is all about looking at, okay, so why are we talking about, it's almost like oxymoron, right? Because when we look at zero trust, right, and we are in the business of trust, right,
Yes.
as
Yeah.
cybersecurity professionals. So then why are we talking about zero trust? So what it really means is that, given the fact that now the perimeter is no longer the traditional perimeter that we had
Mm-hmm.
it, and we have done adoption of cloud, and there is dispersion of all the endpoints, and now we're talking about any place, anytime,
Mm-hmm.
any device access, and
Mm-hmm.
24/7. I think the way we connect computers has fundamentally changed,
Yeah.
right? And and for us to really have trust in that, those connections in today's environment,
Mm-hmm.
you need to embrace zero trust, which means
Mm-hmm.
that I will build additional checks and balances at the right gates
Yeah.
in these connections, so that I feel that these connections are trustworthy,
Yeah.
right? And so therefore, from my perspective, when somebody's coming in, I will have a zero trust on them till that I'm convinced that these
Mm.
connections are trustworthy. And so
Yeah.
then you build different models around that, so that you make it work. So I think that's the simplest way I can explain what zero trust really means.
I love just listening to that in its entirety. So firstly, thank you. Right. And in all of that, I think the really powerful message that you conveyed is that every era brings sort of its own sort of new approach and a new strategy, etc. But I think what to me stood out is when you said, "But the fundamentals remain the same," right? And that I think is such a important lesson, right? And I think zero trust is literally saying that, right? It's really about the fundamentals. And I kind of want to use that actually as a stepping board to some sort of things that you are some of the items that you've been talking about in your monthly newsletter, right? Which is, by the way, which is a great read, and I encourage everyone to go and have a look at it. That you talk about the importance of security hygiene, right? And and the reason I say I equate sort of zero trust with the fundamentals is that I say, well, good security hygiene is the same as good security fundamentals. And one of the fundamentals in that should be that nothing should be granted implicit trust, right? Which is really what zero trust is saying. So security hygiene, it's so important. You articulated it brilliantly, right? But why is it often the same thing that comes sort of every time I read about a new ransomware attack, right? A new breach of any sort. You kind of dig into it, and often the root cause of it, right, is a lack of security hygiene, right? Why is this such a challenge still for organizations large and small?
Yeah, I think, I call this the doing the boring stuff right.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think the reason it does not get so much attention is because it's so boring. But
Mm.
it's not just boring, it's also thankless.
Yeah.
Right? So that is, I think, the other part. And the third part is, it's a hard problem. So
Yeah.
you can imagine why we see, most of the organization get it wrong, because of these three issues, right? So I think we need to do something so that people understand that, we need to glorify the boring stuff, right?
Mm.
It is a fundamental stuff. Number two, we need to figure out a way to incentivize people so
Mm.
that it doesn't become thankless, and reward and recognize the sentinels, right? And it's not the
Mm.
cyber team, it's the technology team, the IT teams
Yeah.
who are constantly, at it. Because
Yeah.
guess what? We are releasing vulnerabilities and we are releasing patches like never before,
Yeah.
right? And you got to get it right. And it's a asymmetric war, right?
Yeah.
You need to get it right all the time, and the bad guys have to get it right only once, right? So we have
Yeah.
a significant amount of asymmetry,
Yeah.
in the way this happens. And the third thing is that time has come when we have, just like you're talking about zero trust, we need to have a zero tolerance
Mm.
towards, basic technology hygiene, right? For
Yeah.
example, no matter how dynamic your IT landscape is, you should know exactly how many assets are there in your
Yeah.
organization,
Yeah.
how many applications are there in your organization, how much of shadow data and how much of shadow IT do you have, how many changes which are happening, where it is happening through a change management process, and how many places you have proper hooks in managing those changes. So, as technology has evolved, we have sort of forced to let go of that control and those hooks that were
Mm.
traditionally very strong in technology and IT
Yeah.
teams, because the whole business units have become empowered to drive their own technology stack. But
Yeah.
by doing
100%.
so, we get a sense of being not able to control, because it becomes a multi-legged hydra, sort of, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we if you start taking an approach of zero tolerance, we need to start getting a sense of more governance around how do we
Yeah.
manage this. While we want to empower people, while we want to have speed and
Mm.
agility, you cannot do at the cost of IT hygiene, and therefore poor security, and therefore
Yeah.
risk of being breached. So I guess, these are some of the important elements that one should look at when we do it. And I think, like you said, and like I've said in past, that majority of the breaches and majority of the attacks that we have seen are not happening because the attackers are using some very tech tech heavy or very sophisticated attacks mechanisms. They're, in fact, some of
Yeah.
the attacks are actually happening in plain sight, right? They don't even need to
Yes.
go
Yes.
and exploit
100%.
something. They already have the credentials from somewhere else. They just log in and
Yeah.
actually do the lateral movement.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's absolutely. By the way, I just want to go back when you were talking about security hygiene as being boring, thankless, difficult, right? It reminds me of trying to get my kids to do homework, right? Because they associate homework with all those three things, and it's kind of, you need to make it interesting, you need to make them see the value, and you need to incentivize them. But and as you say, right, attackers, right? Ultimately, for them, they're in it. It is a it is a business for them, right? So like ideally they want to do low effort, high return, right? And hence they're always attacking the low hanging fruit. But I think you were really kind of in your response, you really introduced something that was like really sort of topical, right? As you say, that now increasingly business teams are running their own tech stacks, right? So it is not the case of saying, okay, IT, you run the infrastructure, go and patch, right? It's, you kind of need to bring everyone along that journey. And I know that one of your sort of areas of real interest is democratizing security, right? So how both as a sort of as a CISO and then also as a practice leader, how do you put in place that model of democratizing sort of security so that all of these diverse groups that have some stakeholders in security in their applications, right? How do they all sort of unite behind that common approach to cyber?
Yeah, I think it's a culture issue, right? I mean, it's about building a culture where we are able to get every stakeholder understand their role in terms of accountability and responsibility towards cybersecurity. I think as a profession, we have not done a great job of advertising this profession well, because when we call ourselves the cybersecurity teams, the perception and expectation is that this team is going to solve and manage my risks, right? And I don't need to do anything. Whereas
Yeah.
actually the
Yeah.
truth is exactly opposite of that, right? I think the cybersecurity teams are the active catalyst for this change, but the actual change is the stakeholders, right? The business leaders, the board,
Yeah.
the organization leadership, the staff, the employees, the technology teams, the IS teams, and every other stakeholder that is there, and each one of them needs to understand their role and accountability and then do it. Now, the bad thing about security is that it's only visible when it's not working, and it's invisible when it's working,
Yeah.
right? So long as there's nobody is exploiting your bad security, you can live in a fallacy that actually, you are secure because nobody is attacking you. I mean, that's exactly what happened in
Yeah.
case of
Yeah.
ransomware, where for the first time when the ransomware came in with WannaCry and NotPetya, it was the first time that we had an indiscriminate impact of a security vulnerability across industries. And suddenly, all the insecurity that was there got exposed, which otherwise was not there. And that's why you can explain that the financial industry is so much regulated and so much mature, because they had all the bulk of the frauds happening till such time that we started seeing ransomware. And ransomware
Yeah.
just impacts anybody who comes in contact. And
Yeah.
guess what? In internet, everybody comes in contact with everyone, right?
Yeah.
So coming back to your point,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
you need to start looking at it from that point of view, to make sure that we democratize it, right? And every stakeholder understand
Yeah.
their role very clearly. And it has to be done as a culture. And every opportunity you get, you need to make sure it's driven so that it becomes a cultural problem where, and I must tell you this upfront, Raghu, that we still are at a nascent stage when we talk about understanding of cybersecurity as a cultural issue, right? People, even now, as we see, most of the stakeholders externalize it. They don't think
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is their problem. And there's always this issue that we suffer. The cybersecurity is seen like a rocket science. It's seen as something which is
Yes. Yeah.
only a
Yeah.
specialist can do. It's not. It's not, right? I think it is very common sense
Yeah.
thing. Anybody who understands fundamentals of technology, it doesn't take much time for them to understand the principles and fundamentals of cybersecurity. In fact, the
Yeah.
remediation,
Uh,
is something which has to be done by people who have admin access. It cannot be done by the cybersecurity professionals. They can at best find out and risk and vulnerabilities and tell with you, but they need to,
Yeah.
the teams who have access are the ones who should be exercising it, and they should know how to configure systems securely, right? So I think that is the change that we need to drive, and that is what I mean by democratizing cyber.
I mean, there's so much good content in what you've just covered there, right? That's just so much that I could sort of just deep dive. I think we could do like a podcast episode about every segment of just what you said. But I want to ask then that firstly, I think cybersecurity, I kind of, if you boil it down, it's common sense, right? It like applying common sense to a variety of technology and information problems is really what cybersecurity is fundamentally about. And when it comes to sort of that culture shift, right, and everyone being involved in cybersecurity, right, and sort of as the cliche goes, right, sort of your first line of defense are your people, and they need to be engaged in your cyber program. Does like a organizations who are adopting a zero trust strategy, right, does sort of like democratizing security form a key part of any successful zero trust adoption? Is what's your thoughts?
No, absolutely. I mean, zero trust is a methodology to deploy your security architecture. And the only way you can be successful in deploying a security architecture is where all the stakeholders come to the party. For example, when you talk about zero trust, one of the important changes which are happening is about there is a convergence which is happening between security and network. And we need to get the network team on the table to be able to really put the architecture together, because that is going to be the future of security and network, and so the old models, traditional models of connectivity are getting significantly challenged, and unless we are able to change the mindset of the network team to adopt this software defined security and software defined network, it becomes difficult. So I think that collaboration and partnership is important. Only if they do that at an architectural level, we can be really successful in driving implementation of that. So therefore, I think as much as it is technical, I think it's also human and cultural aspect which needs to be driven. So that. So I definitely believe that both the things have to happen together for you to have a successful program.
This is kind of where I'd be interested to get both your CISO take and your practice leader take, right? Is that how do you demonstrate tangible ROI from security investments, both prior to getting that commitment from your board to make the investment, but then also, let's say 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, where someone asks, okay, we spent X, show me what I'm getting in return. How do you do that?
So, my views on this is that you should not get into this trouble of trying to convince any finance person ROI on security products, right? Because, you can argue on both sides and you can never agree, right? If you don't want to. So I think it's a futile exercise. I know people do that, but I don't think you should do that. I think the way the model should work is like this. You need to decide as an organization what is the risk that you have because of cybersecurity to your organization, and how much are you willing to invest. That is number one, right? And then, so in my mind, security is all about getting better every single day, right? So where you are today, you need to get better tomorrow, and then day after it has to be better than tomorrow. So that's really how you should do it. It can never be that today you're 0, tomorrow you're going to be 100. It's just not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So there has to be a level of trust that once you've got a team, professional team to deliver it, you say, how you need to spend this money. You go and deliver the max value, and I'll hold you accountable for it, right? Because it's only the security team who then needs to really justify to themselves how they want to spend that money, right? And they would know the best whether it is delivering value or not. There's no other person external who can ever come close to really understanding what they're doing, right? Especially from finance. So I think this, you need to really flip it over the head and say that, don't waste time in terms of trying to come out with mathematical calculation of ROI, but empower the teams to drive their own ROI. So within security teams, you can definitely do ROI, right? You can know how much you're invested and how that control, what is the efficiency and efficacy of that control. You can do that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But don't allow somebody else to come and challenge and challenge that process, because at the end of the day, you will spend more times explaining that to the third person rather than
Yeah.
actually that time is well spent in actually protecting your organization.
I mean, I'm laughing because the reason I'm laughing is because I'm sure there are lots of sales leaders who will have heard that, right? And will press the tape in front of like an economic buyer and say, "Look what the CISO emphasis says about trying to convince you about the value of this investment," right?
Yeah. And I think
So
again, I'll
yeah.
say, Raghu, that I've been again privileged that I've been working in mature organizations who have left us to do our job and not
Yeah.
really spend too much time in really asking, where you're spending this money, why you're spending this money here, and because what will happen is if you do that, then you will end up spending on controls which are low on your priority because the finance guy is convinced on that compared to the one which is more important for you, right?
That
Uh, and that's when I think it becomes a problem. So hence, it is better we do it this way.
that's I really like the way you express that, right? But so then let me ask you a related question, right? Is that how like you have sort of two, okay, as a security practitioner, right? You've done a risk assessment, right? You've threat modeled your environment and you've identified your gaps, right? Where do you now say, okay, I have a pot of money, right? And I have, it's up to me where I invest it, right? What drives the investment saying capability X or capability Y? And then how do you measure that you're getting value out of that?
Yeah, I think it's all about the methodology of looking at your risk assessment, and so we do it obviously every year, and you do the best way to do that is to have a foundation of your enterprise risk assessment where we have looked at all the risk and looked at which are the ones which are high risk and how you want to prioritize remediation. And then you look at, okay, what's out there and what do I need to do, and what are the important elements that I need to look at it. And then you stay, okay, you do a classification, and then you say, okay, these are the ones which I need to really, and of course you need to look at affordability, because you can't even if you, for example, get all the money that is required for all of them, it's impractical for you to actually even execute that. You'll
Yeah.
struggle to actually then spend that money, right? So you need to be able to balance it between practically how much you will be able to implement, and also what is the affordability of your organization, given your organization context and your business context. And you need to be realistic around that. You cannot be asking for a bottomless kind of situation, right? So I think if you are able to do both these things and calibrate it well, then you get a pot of money, and then obviously you define the program, give it to your team, and say, okay, now that you have this, now make sure you execute it. But more importantly, I think you need to make sure that you do a post-implementation review of that investment
Yeah.
and give that feedback back to the teams so that they are able to get some assurance that we have been able to execute our programs as
Yeah.
defined in a timely
Yeah.
manner and achieve our
Yeah.
objectives.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
brings in more trust.
Yes, 100%. 100%. So, like, with that, right? What are you seeing as sort of the success rates in sort of, let's say, clients in sort of adopting a zero trust strategy, right? Those who've sort of taken that path and are taking that path potentially with yourselves, helping them. What are you seeing as sort of some of the successes and failures?
Yeah, I think the challenge in adopting it is that we are actually currently in a very complex kind of architecture world, right? Where we have uh, multiple solutions, multiple tools. Some of them are integrated, a lot of them are working in silos, and it's sort of like a very complicated assembly of different technologies, right? And and there is a need to consolidate, there is a need to integrate, there is a need to look at it, deeply with the integration with the tech stack, right?
Hmm.
And I think we are far away from that. So that is one very significant, important challenge, and a lot of the reasons why the implementation are not successful is because of this, right?
Hmm.
The other part is, in terms of, there's so much of legacy that, how do I sort of, what do I prioritize and how do I modernize,
Mm.
right? And do I do a open heart surgery or do I take medicines,
Yeah.
right? I think those questions are very, very critical and important. And very often, because of the huge amount of legacy, it's not very easy to change and pivot to a new way of doing things, right?
Yeah.
There are forward-looking organizations who are taking a completely different approach towards completely doing major transformations and major modernization of their
Hmm.
tech as well as their security stack.
Hmm.
And once they look at it as a program and drive it holistically, I think those organizations have a better chance of being successful,
Hmm.
uh, rather than doing it piecemeal, right?
Yeah.
Especially because we are pivoting big time on sort of hybrid world and adoption
Yeah.
of cloud, and that is not a trivial change, right? It's a
Yeah.
massive transformation,
Yeah.
and you cannot underline the importance of security architecture change,
Yeah.
for that. So
Yeah.
so I think change is very, very important and significant.
Yeah, sure. And do you think do you think one transformation, this whole sort of architectural change, consumption model change, and even sort of right down to sort of how we build applications, right? Um, does that change need to be mature before the security transformation can happen, or do you see this as very much parallel tracks that must happen together in sync?
I think what is required is, it has to be a collaborative effort. For example,
Hmm.
when you're doing any new application, you need to look at threat modeling. You need to start looking at, apart from doing other things, you should also start looking at API security, secure SDLC, secure
Hmm.
CI/CD pipeline. So many things are required to be done, right? So I think it has to be done. I would say it will be unrealistic to expect that everything will happen at the same time. I think what is important is collaborative effort and approach towards secure by design. So everything
Mm.
that you do, you should always have security considerations into it.
Yeah.
Uh, do not ignore security, because you can't imagine any world today without digital,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And wherever there is a digital security has to be there.
Yeah.
I think that is the fundamental foundation of creating a future proof architecture,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So and that change is important. And if somebody is just using a credit card and buying a cloud workload and then just putting some business code and trying to do something, and you blatantly ignored all security controls, you are just asking for a disaster to happen,
Yeah.
right? So that's really what I'm meaning.
Yeah. You speak like you've seen that, right?
Sure.
I read one of your really interesting posts, and I think it was titled "Zero Trust with Zero Touch," right? And you introduce sort of the idea about how ML and maybe in the future more sort of general purpose AI is really going to benefit the implementation of zero trust controls, right? And the sort of I'm going to call it like always on security, right? Or secure by design, or however you want to call it. Where do you believe the application of machine learning and then more generally sort of AI towards sort of zero trust? Like, what is that?
Yeah, so Raghu, actually, zero trust through zero touch, really what it really means is a vision to do hyper automation, right?
Mm.
That's really what it means, right? Because
Mm.
human beings are not scaling up. to solving security operations problem, right? It's you will always find lapses because we just can't get it right? So just like cars are now fully automated, and uh, robots are making cars, you need to have robots who need to make security operations work, right? That's really what it means. But that's the vision,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
that's where we need to go to. I don't think we're ready there right now. I would say
Hmm.
that we would not have come where we are in security innovation without use of ML, because there is a
Hmm.
significant amount of ML in everything that we do. Every aspect of security of
Yeah.
technology today has lot of learning, because we won't be
Yeah.
stopping
Yeah.
92% of the spam if we didn't have ML, right? Uh,
Yeah.
I think the use of AI and how we do it in future is going to be it's going to be important aspect to watch
Hmm.
for. There are many examples of use cases where we could do it. For example, in testing, in terms
Mm.
of monitoring, we could actually create AI algorithms for all of that, and they will get more and more mature. At the same time, we will also look at adversarial AI, and how do we start mitigating and building some controls around that.
Hmm.
And then there is a third thing, right? Just like we have security by design, we have privacy by design. Ethical AI by design is going to be an important element of future, and
Yeah.
so we'll have to closely watch and see how it impacts the cybersecurity world, right?
Hmm. So what do the people do then?
Well, I think the people are the ones who design it, and we all the cognitive work should go into thinking
Mm.
rather than doing mundane activities, right? Which is what we are right now using some very cognitive bandwidth into
Mm.
doing things which are not adding value to
Yeah.
the human. I mean, so I and anyway we have a serious challenge of demand versus supply, right?
Hmm.
So I think we will never get away from this situation of zero unemployment for cybersecurity professionals, right? In spite of all the automation that we will do. So I
Yeah.
don't think that is any risk that we need to worry about.
Yeah.
I think we should always strive to do more and more cognitive work and full automate everything which does not add value.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Knock on wood that us cyber professionals have jobs forever. So just like before we wrap, right? Like what excites you about what's on the horizon as a cyber practice leader, right? What is it from your that you are seeing from your clients that really gives you sort of excitement as a security practitioner?
Yeah, I mean, see, on one side, I'm always hoping that we are able to solve this problem and we have lesser breaches and lesser incidents, because that is the world that we want to aim for, and we don't want to have a situation where we are waiting for more incidents to happen so that we can we can have more job security or more revenues coming in, right? I at least I don't subscribe to that. So I want to have a world where we are more safer digitally, just like we have been able to solve this problem for air travel and so many other activities where there is a zero
Mm.
tolerance to any risks.
Yeah.
I think cyber will reach that tipping point at some stage where everybody will wake up and everybody will start taking it very, very seriously. And
Yeah.
we would have truly democratized cyber. I think that's when actually it will tip and then start going down. And it'll
Mm.
become a non issue. Eventually, it will not be a news anymore. And it'll be a way of doing things.
Yeah.
But we are far away from that, maybe decades away from that right now. Right now, it is still somebody getting breached is a headline news right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we need to, so we will make hopefully more secure systems by design,
Yeah.
so that we don't have these the challenge of patching and putting band-aids every time, and
Yeah.
getting the whole plumbing messed up.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting, right? Because it lands nicely on this real push that we are seeing around cyber resilience, right? That it's almost like breaches are going to happen, right? If we build our infrastructure, our controls, etc., in a way that allows us to just continue to function as optimally as possible, then they just essentially become an inconvenience, right? They don't become headline news every time the same thing happens.
No, I think cyber resilience is a very important topic. in today's context, because we have to assume that the breaches are going to happen, and you have to find out, you have to have a way in which your organization is able to calmly and coolly respond to that particular breach in a manner where they're not able to just contain and recover from that, but also go back to business resumption very quickly, and do it in a
Yeah.
very professional and a calm manner, right? And everybody understanding their roles and
Yeah.
responsibilities, and we having proper playbook, to execute that. So I think that's a very important topic,
Yeah.
and most very large number of organizations are looking at that. And I think it's something which is an important ingredient of your strategy going forward.
Yeah, I like the words calmly and coolly. Cyber resilience is being able to calmly and coolly continue operation even under sort of even post breach. Yeah, that's a nice thing to leave the listeners with. Well, Vishal, look, really appreciate the time you've taken to just have this conversation with us here on the segment. Um, Everyone listening, right, please go and check out Vishal's blog monthly newsletter on LinkedIn. It's excellent, amazing CISO insights from Vishal himself. It's called Cyber Talks, a CISO's take on all things cyber security. Vishal, thank you so much. Just this has been a pleasure.
Thank you, and same here. Thank you so much for having me here today, Raghu, and it was a pleasure talking, and I really enjoyed this conversation.